had returned from war. His neighbor said one sentence that changed everything. The sound of breaking glass shattered the silence of the night. James Parker bolted upright in bed, his heart hammering against his ribs, sweat beading on his forehead. It took him several disorienting seconds to realize he wasn't back in Kandahar. He was home. The glass had fallen from his nightstand when his trembling hands had reached out during another nightmare. If you're finding this story touching already, please consider hitting that like button and subscribing to the channel. Your support means everything, and there's so much more to this emotional journey that you won't want to miss. James swung his legs over the side of the bed, wincing as his prosthetic leg caught on the tangled sheets. 14 months since the IED explosion that took his leg, and he still wasn't used to waking up like this. The digital clock on his bedside table read 3:17 a.m. Another sleepless night stretched ahead. Down the hall, his 5-year-old daughter Emma slept peacefully, blissfully unaware of her father's struggles. She'd been just 3 when he deployed, and sometimes James wondered if she even remembered what life was like before he came home broken. Before her mother decided that caring for a wounded veteran and their daughter was more than she'd signed up for. The morning light filtered through the blinds as James prepared Emma's breakfast. His movements were mechanical, practiced through months of forced routine. Emma chatted happily about kindergarten and her friends, while James nodded and smiled, trying to focus on her words instead of the persistent ringing in his ears, another unwelcome souvenir from the explosion. "Daddy, you're not listening," Emma pouted, her small face scrunching up in disappointment. "I'm sorry, sweetheart," James said, reaching across the table to smooth her unruly blonde curls. "Daddy's just a little tired today." "You're tired every day," she observed with the brutal honesty only children possess. James felt the familiar stab of guilt. She deserved better than a father who couldn't even pay attention to her stories about finger painting and playground adventures. After dropping Emma off at school, James returned to their modest home in the quiet suburban neighborhood where he'd grown up. The house had been his parents', left to him after they passed. It was the only reason he and Emma had a roof over their heads now that he was struggling to find steady work. The lawn needed mowing. The gutters needed cleaning. The porch steps were starting to rot. The list of repairs seemed endless, and James felt overwhelmed just looking at his home. Everything felt like it was falling apart, including himself. As he stood staring at the overgrown grass, he noticed his elderly neighbor, Mr. Wilson, watching him from across the street. The old man had lived there for as long as James could remember. They'd exchanged polite nods since James returned, but little else. James raised his hand in a half-hearted wave, then turned to go inside, eager to escape the judgmental gaze he imagined was following him. "Son, Mr. Wilson called out, his voice surprisingly strong for a man in his 80s. "I could use some help with my garden this afternoon. I'd pay you, of course." James hesitated. The last thing he wanted was charity disguised as work. "I'm not looking for handouts," he said stiffly. "Mr. Wilson chuckled, the sound warm and genuine. "Neither am I. These old bones aren't what they used to be, and that garden won't tend itself. I'm offering fair pay for honest work." Before James could formulate another excuse, Mr. Wilson said the words that would change everything. "Besides, I think we both know what it's like to come home from war and find that home isn't the same place we left behind." James stared at his neighbor, really seeing him for the first time. The straight posture despite his age, the watchful eyes that seemed to take in everything, the quiet dignity that James had mistaken for judgment. "Vietnam?" James asked. "Korea, actually, Mr. Wilson replied. 1952. Lost my hearing in my right ear and came home to find my fiancée had married someone else." Something shifted in James's chest, a recognition, a kinship he hadn't felt since leaving his unit. He nodded slowly. "I'll be over after lunch." That afternoon, as James helped Mr. Wilson, Harold, as he insisted James call him, with his immaculate garden, the old man shared stories of his own return from war. The nightmares that had plagued him, the anger that had threatened to consume him, the loneliness of feeling like a stranger in his own hometown. "The hardest part," Harold said as they took a break on his porch, "was feeling like no one understood. Like I was speaking a language no one else knew." James nodded, his throat tight. "Emma tries, but she's just a kid. She shouldn't have to understand." "No, she shouldn't," Harold agreed. "But she needs her father. Not the man you were before, Because that man doesn't exist anymore. She needs the man you are now. The words hit James like a physical blow. He'd been so focused on what he'd lost, his leg, his marriage, his identity as a soldier, that he hadn't considered what remained. Who remained? Emma needed him, not some idealized version of a father he could never be again. As the weeks passed, James found himself spending more time with Harold. The old man taught him about gardening, about patience, about finding peace in the simple act of nurturing something and watching it grow. In return, James helped with household repairs and listened to Harold's stories about his late wife, about the family they'd never been able to have, about the life he'd built after coming home from a war that few people understood or remembered. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, James began to heal. The nightmares didn't disappear, but they became less frequent. He found part-time work as a handyman, using skills Harold had helped him refine. He started attending a support group for veterans at Harold's gentle insistence. Most importantly, he began to truly see Emma again, not as a responsibility or a reminder of his failures, but as the beautiful, resilient little girl she was. He listened to her stories with genuine interest. He helped her plant her own small garden in their backyard. He learned to laugh again when she made silly jokes. One evening, as they sat on their porch watching the sunset, Emma leaned against his side and said, "Daddy, I'm glad you're not sad all the time anymore." James wrapped his arm around her small shoulders. "Me too, sweetheart." "Is it because of Mr. Harold?" she asked, her perception startling him once again. James considered the question. "Partly," he admitted. "He helped me remember something important." "What's that?" "That sometimes the bravest thing a soldier can do is learn how to be a civilian again." Emma nodded solemnly, as if she understood completely, then skipped off to chase fireflies in the yard. Later that night, after tucking Emma into bed, James sat on his own porch steps, looking across at Harold's house. The old man was watering his front flowers despite the late hour, a habit James had come to recognize as Harold's way of finding calm before sleep. James thought about the sentence that had changed everything for him. "I think we both know what it's like to come home from war and find that home isn't the same place we left behind." In that moment, Harold had offered more than just employment or friendship. He'd offered understanding, recognition, the acknowledgement that James wasn't alone in his struggle, that others had walked this difficult path before him and found their way forward. 6 months after that first conversation, James's life had transformed. He'd started his own small handyman business, specializing in helping elderly neighbors with home repairs. He'd become active in the local veterans group, eventually leading meetings for newly returned service members. He'd even begun dating again, a kindergarten teacher from Emma's school who saw his scars, both visible and invisible, and wasn't frightened by them. But the most profound change was within himself. The anger that had simmered beneath the surface had cooled. The grief for his old life had transformed into appreciation for his new one. The isolation he'd felt had given way to connection, with Emma, with Harold, with his community, and with himself. On the anniversary of his return home, James invited Harold over for dinner. Emma had helped make her specialty, macaroni and cheese with hot dogs cut into octopus shapes, and had decorated the table with flowers from their garden. After dinner, when Emma had gone to play in her room, James poured 2 glasses of whiskey and handed one to Harold. "I never properly thanked you," James said. Harold waved away the words. "No need for that." "There is," James insisted. "A year ago, I was drowning. I couldn't see a future for myself, let alone for Emma. You threw me a lifeline when you didn't have to." Harold took a sip of his whiskey, his eyes distant with memory. "Someone did the same for me once. A World War II vet who lived in my neighborhood when I came back from Korea. He saw me sitting on my porch one night, staring at nothing, and he just knew. Came over, sat down beside me, and started talking about the weather like it was the most natural thing in the world." James smiled, recognizing the strategy. Harold had done the same with him, approached obliquely, offering connection without demanding vulnerability. "He told me something I never forgot," Harold continued. He said, "The war takes things from all of us. But what it can't take, unless we let it, is our capacity to build something new from what remains." James nodded, feeling the truth of those words in his bones. "I'm trying to build something new," he said. "For Emma. For myself." "I know you are," Harold replied. "And you're doing a fine job of it." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, two soldiers from different wars, different generations, united by a common experience and a shared understanding. "You know," James said eventually, "Emma asked me the other day if you were her grandfather." Harold's eyes widened, then softened. "What did you tell her?" "I told her that family isn't always about blood. Sometimes it's about who shows up when you need them most." Harold's weathered hand trembled slightly as he set down his glass. "I'd be honored," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "I never had children of my own. Never thought I'd get the chance to be anyone's grandfather." "Well, you've got a 5-year-old granddaughter now who thinks you hang the moon," James said with a smile. "And her father isn't far behind in his admiration." That night, after Harold had gone home and Emma was asleep, James stood in his backyard looking up at the stars. The same stars that had shone over him in Afghanistan, that had witnessed his darkest moments and his greatest triumphs. The same stars that would continue to shine long after he was gone. He thought about the journey he'd been on since returning home. The pain, the loss, the struggle to find his place in a world that had moved on without him. And he thought about the unexpected gift he'd received from an elderly neighbor who had recognized in James's eyes the same battle he'd fought decades earlier. One sentence had changed everything. "I think we both know what it's like to come home from war and find that home isn't the same place we left behind." With those words, Harold had acknowledged James's pain without pity. He'd offered connection without intrusion. He'd extended his hand across the chasm of isolation that surrounds so many veterans, creating a bridge that James could choose to cross. And James had crossed it. Step by painful step, he'd made his way back to the land of the living. Not as the man he'd been before. That man was gone forever, but as someone new. Someone stronger in the broken places. Someone who understood that healing wasn't about erasing the past, but about building a future that honored it. As the years passed, James's business thrived. Emma grew into a confident, compassionate young woman who was fiercely proud of her father. Harold became a beloved fixture in their lives, a grandfather in every way that mattered. And James continued to reach out to other veterans, sharing his story and the wisdom Harold had shared with him. He became known in the community as someone who understood, who wouldn't judge, who could help navigate the difficult terrain between soldier and civilian. On Harold's 90th birthday, the entire neighborhood gathered to celebrate. As James watched the old man surrounded by friends and well-wishers, he marveled at how one person's kindness could ripple outward, touching countless lives. Emma, now 15, sidled up beside him. "Dad," she said, "remember when you first started hanging out with Grandpa Harold?" James nodded, smiling at the memory. "I do. You were so different then," she said thoughtfully. "Sadder. Angrier." James agreed. "I was lost." "What changed?" she asked. James looked across the yard at Harold, who caught his eye and raised his glass in a silent toast. "Someone showed me the way home," James said simply. That night, after the party had ended and the guests had gone, James and Harold sat on Harold's porch, just as they had countless times over the past decade. "Thank you," James said, "for everything." Harold shook his head. "No need for thanks between family." James smiled, acknowledging the truth in those words. "Still," he persisted, "I want you to know that what you did, reaching out to me that day, it didn't just change my life. It saved it." Harold was quiet for a long moment. "We save each other," he said finally. "That's what humans do. That's what soldiers do. We leave no one behind." As they sat together under the stars, James thought about all the men and women still struggling to find their way home from wars both recent and long past. He thought about the power of one sentence, spoken with understanding and compassion, to change a life, to save a life. And he made a silent promise to continue Harold's legacy, to be the bridge for others that Harold had been for him, to reach across the divide of isolation and say, in whatever words were needed, "You are not alone. I understand. Let me help you find your way home." Because in the end, that's what it means to be a true warrior, not just to fight bravely in battle, but to live courageously in peace, to rebuild what war has broken, to create something beautiful from the ashes of loss, to transform pain into purpose and isolation into connection. One sentence had changed everything for James Parker, and in the years that followed, he would change everything for others with sentences of his own, continuing the circle of healing that Harold had begun. If this story touched your heart, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to our channel. Your support helps us share more stories of hope, healing, and human connection. Remember that sometimes the most powerful thing we can offer another person is understanding, and that a single sentence, spoken with compassion, truly can change everything.